Well, as we come back together, I did want to mention just again, thanks to Lex for helping us in those first couple hours with some of the Zoom stuff. Really appreciate his assistance, and again, just appreciate all the folks who've come. Just several people that are important to me in various ways in my life that are either attending in person here or on Zoom, and I know of several other people are going to be later watching on recording form. So just very excited that makes it really special for all of you to be here. So for our last session, we're going to be shifting gears a fair bit, and that is we're going to be moving into the present moment in time. And so let me cue up. So anyway, what I'll first be sharing is we'll be talking at first about the situation in the state of Israel. And really the reason why I wanted to focus this last hour specifically on Israel and the United States are that if you look at where Jews are at in the world, pretty high percentage, I want to say 90% probably, of Jews are located in either the US or in the state of Israel. So really focusing on these two communities make a lot of sense. The other reason, though, for many of us in the United States and the parts of the world, even if we ourselves don't have family or friends in Israel directly, we still have connections. And many of us are also involved in complicated forms of activism related to the state of Israel, particularly with the situation in Gaza right now. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the broader issues of what's happening there at this moment. We're kind of staying focused on the issue of conscientious objection. But I did want to mention before we go on to this next section is he's going to be dealing very heavily with the situation in Gaza as it relates to Israeli conscientious objectors. The situation in Israel is complicated for a number of reasons. One is that they have had a draft since their beginning. They have drafted men and women. They have provided more exemptions for women in various contexts to be exempted from the draft, but still generally men and women are drafted. There are some weird exemptions, though. One being is that Palestinian Israelis, people who are of Arab descent but who are Israeli citizen, are exempted from the draft. And again, when you consider that the fact that throughout Jewish history, military service was tied to citizenship, was tied to being a part of society, the fact that non-Jewish Israelis are not drafted is kind of troubling in some ways, also a mercy in others, but it's there. Also, until very recently, men who were engaged in full-time Torah study were exempted from the draft. That has changed under current policy of the Netanyahu government. We'll see if that sticks. There's political currents that are attacking that in various ways.
Question is,
Just
can Palestinian Israelis volunteer? Are they allowed to serve?
I do not know that. So we had a question here in person about whether Palestinian Israelis volunteer for IDF service, and I do not. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to. So if anyone does know, feel free to put in the chat because it would be great to know. So in the state of Israel, generally, as it relates to exemptions to the draft, the most common ones are going to be medical grounds, mental health grounds. Conscientious objection itself is fairly difficult to receive a discharge on. And part of it is in the state of Israel, the framing is largely that they largely reject anyone who has a whiff of politics about them in any way. So if it's tied at all to the occupation of Palestine, to current Israeli actions, those get rejected really quickly. And so because of that, what ends up happening in Israel looks a lot more like draft resistance of actual and of just outright refusal to serve. And so I have a video I'd like to share. In the chat, it does mention Palestinian citizens of Israel can volunteer for the IDF. Yes, though I believe only a few thousand have. Thank you. So the video I want to share, this was from The Guardian, and I really liked this particular video a lot because it really gives a good summary of the issue, but it also gives a picture of how so I'm trying to type this. There we go. it gives a picture of how the draft both unites Israeli society and also divides it. Um, so let me real quick, this one isn't working, so let me find a diff. This was from the Guardian. Take one. Uh, Here it is. Okay. So this video is 12 minutes long, but I think it really gives a good summary of the issue. So let me, before I do the share screen, I have to make sure and have the sound, share sound. And then we'll watch this, and then we'll have a few minutes of this conversation about it. But then after that, we'll move on to talking about the situation in the U.S. So that was a really powerful video, and there was so many things about it that to me were significant. For me, I think especially seeing the family dynamics of how this family was working through so many of these issues, and how they managed to still love each other. I thought that was pretty remarkable. What jumped out at you about this video? What thoughts do you have that might spark for our situations in our lives?
Just
I think
the,
this is interesting that this is a story that I think is just not getting told enough. It's not getting talked about here. I certainly would think that most of the people at, you know, my temple and reform circles here in Oklahoma would be shocked to hear that this, young man was, the longest jailed conscientious objector. And I think that's sad that that piece of it maybe isn't being talked about or told about, because I think it's an important part of the story of what's happening right now.
Mhm. Well, and I think for me, just personally, it hit me watching this video because this Itamar is the same age as my son, who's 18, about to turn 19, and it really puts it in really tremendous. I don't know, the realizing the difficult questions that we force people at this age to make, and I don't know. I was very impressed with Itamar and how he framed the issues, how he thought it through. Was really deeply moved by that. I would say that for us here in the United States, I do think one of the ongoing things that we can be doing now is to share awareness of these issues in the state of Israel, and to often conscription is framed as this great uniting principle in Israeli society, and in some ways that's correct, and in some ways that's not the whole story. Lex.
yeah, I mean, I both understand very deeply why the primary messaging that he talks about is that the the ongoing apartheid and brutalization of Palestinians means that he can't support this. I do think it's interesting that he didn't, at least in this video, bring up just the general question of forced enlistment as an issue. Like he it's not asking that question, which like in a world where everything involving Israelis and Palestinians was resolved, I still would want Israel not to have a forced enlistment for the set of people that it has. And so I don't know. I'm not criticizing him on that. I think it's important for the purpose of Palestinian humanity to shine a light on that issue at every possible opportunity. But I do think it's interesting given the broader conversation that we're having today.
Absolutely. And I don't think that that conversation is happening in a big enough way yet in the state of Israel. I do think there's just kind of this idea that it's so embedded, it's again, the word I keep thinking is this existential idea that if we don't have this force, if we don't do X, Y, and Z, our entire nation would fall apart and would be no more. Don't think that's accurate myself, but that's how it's understood. Susan.
I think that's interesting what that implies about the Israeli state and Israeli society, that it depends on forced conscription is absolutely necessary to hold it together, and that size of military force is necessary. I think it says a little bit, maybe perhaps people should examine a little more closely what that means, what that implies about your society and about your politics and about your situation. That this is necessary to feed your young people into the machine to keep your society going. There's a
Yeah.
certain aspect of societal sacrifice of the young that people should maybe think a little more closely about, because if that is necessary, then is this a situation sustainable, and should you be doing it? There's this expression I heard a little while ago that I've been using: if it can be destroyed by the truth, it should be destroyed by the truth. And that's it's not like a universal principle, but it's an interesting idea, right? So the idea that your society would fall apart without this, maybe it should, or maybe it should be restructured, or maybe there are fundamental questions that should be answered before you say that this is the answer.
I'm a huge fan of Yuval Noah Harari, and in one of his works, he writes really poignantly at the end about how growing up in Israel, how celebrated the martyrs were, and that each year, basically on Memorial Day, that everyone would dress in white and all of the children would be singing and honoring these dead soldiers, and how as a young boy growing up, how much he yearned to be a dead soldier because he wanted that kind of reverence put upon him. And so it clearly was, deeply ingrained in a lot of Israelis from a very, very young age, that this idea that you are destined to serve in the military and sacrifice yourself, for the military, and that you will be lauded. And it wasn't until he got to a certain age that he described suddenly realizing, but wait, if I die, I'll be dead, and I won't be here to have anybody laud me or honor me, and I won't get to see that honor in my name because I'm going to be dead. Wait a second, I need to think about this more seriously. And so I do think that it's a culture that has put a lot into this idea in young people from a very young age. And therefore I'm really impressed when I see young people that are thinking for themselves and not immediately falling into that cultural story, but they're thinking, more clearly about it on a personal level.
It probably should, the question should be asked, how healthy is that on a societal and a personal level? That how healthy is that mindset, and how sustainable is that mindset?
Yeah.
And I think those questions, I think they are being asked. I think they've always been asked, but we don't hear about it. Right? Because there's support both internally and externally for it in Israel, and there's support for, blind support for Israel elsewhere. And there's no questions being asked about whether this is healthy or sustainable. And look, in individuals who have this mindset, is that a good thing for them individually? Is that fulfilling them as individuals? So.
Well, this is probably a good time for us to transition to the next part of our conversation, which is to look at the situation in the U.S. today. And looking at our situation in the U.S. today, we are in a very different society, and yet we also are in a very similar society. What's different, of course, is we don't have conscription or draft in the U.S. today. We do have draft registration. We have the machinery set up to implement a draft. We don't have it yet. We do have what some people call a poverty draft, which is that there are many young people who literally are led to believe that their only choice to make it in society is to enlist. In fact, I heard today a public school teacher in Oklahoma say that at his school, how that they're being told that we need to encourage the kids to, after high school, to enroll, employ, or enlist. That's literally the tagline that his school is using to encourage their graduating seniors. They have to do something: enroll, employ, enlist. And by framing military service in this way, it is tied. And again, my friend's school, it's a low income school. And so this has been a part of U.S. History for a long time, that even when we haven't had a draft, our society has exploited certain classes of people to keep the system going. And so but also there's another similarity right now, and that is both the state of Israel and the U.S. are led by, let's be frank, fascists. These are people who don't honor democratic values, and that we have a lot of fear for what is to come. And so I do think that we can learn a lot from our Israeli lady friends of the struggles they're going through right now for the sake of peace, for the sake of conscience. I do think there's things we can learn. For us here in the United States, though, in our current moment in time, there's really two big categories that are, I think, most pressing right now. The first one is for people who are in the military currently, active duty and reserve, but people who have had a change of heart. And secondly, being prepared if a draft was called in the future. So for the first category, people who are currently in the military, one thing that was not often talked about is the fact that conscientious objection to war does not simply function in the context of a draft. It also, under U.S. law, also applies for people who are in the military. Now, the important element here is that when you enlist in the military, they ask you at your MEPS, military enlistment processing station, are you a conscientious objector? And if you say yes, you are sent out the door. You are no longer eligible to enlist. And so if you enlist in bad faith, not believing in war, but believing deciding to fake it, you've committed the crime of fraudulent enlistment. So the idea is when you enlist, you of course say, yes, I can do this. But what happens if someone has a change of heart? It could be due to a religious conversion. It could be due to a battlefield or training experience. It could be due to life circumstances. I've had clients who have told me it was after reading a book or watching a movie. But lots of things triggers people's conscience. And under current law in the US, a service member can go through a process to have their status changed, to be recognized as a conscientious objector. The process is not easy. It's a very grueling and difficult process. It begins with the drafting of an application, which is a set of very complicated, of very challenging open-ended essay questions. Most people going through this process do work through a GI rights counseling group or some other group to help them with their application, because there's so many pitfalls when you write these. But you then put that all together, you find supporting documentation, and then you give it to your commander. At that moment, under the law, you're given certain protections, including that you're to be given duties that conflict as little as possible with your conscience while your claim is being heard. Not long after that, what happens next? You're sent to a military psychologist to be assessed. You're sent to a chaplain to also be assessed. They both write reports, and then you appear before an independent investigating officer, an IO. The IO conducts a hearing, hears witnesses, reads your witness statements and other documents you might present. And then the IO makes a recommendation. Yes, this person should be discharged, or no, they should not. Then what happens is the claim goes up the chain of command. Each level of the chain of command can say yay or nay. Along the way, if you get negative recommendations, you as the applicant have the chance to rebut those applications. It finally goes all the way to the Pentagon. Each of the service branches has a conscientious objector review board who looks at the whole case, makes a recommendation, and finally the branch secretary, either the Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, etc., makes a final decision on whether you'll be discharged or not. Most of the time, this takes 6 months to a year at least. Very difficult process. Now, I will say there are a very small percentage of service members today who are Jewish. There are some. And so I do want to mention, for any Jewish professionals who are here participating, watching this video later, I will say that you can't count on chaplains to give accurate information about these issues at all. One is that there are very few, very, very few Jewish chaplains, but even those who are well-versed on Jewish issues often are not well-versed on conscientious objection issues, which is why it's important if you know someone in your congregation or your community who's dealing with these issues, who's currently in the military, you need to refer them. And so I'm going to real quick share a screen because I want to show a couple of these few of these organizations that I'm a fan of that can be of assistance to folks in these situations. So let me jump over to that. So the first of these, I have these all. It's not what I'm looking for. Okay, we'll start with this one. This is the Center on Conscience and War. Their website is centeronconscience.org. But on this page here, it's a great place, a starting point. So um, you can click here, get information on who is a conscience objector. There's an online CO application writing tool. They have a guide for conscientious objectors, lots of good resources there. Another group that works with conscientious objectors directly is Quaker House. And again, their website is quakerhouse.org. The last website I want to share for, again, Jewish professionals who might be in attendance is the GI Rights Hotline. Their website is girightshotline.org. Their number is 1-877-447-4487. I would especially recommend this organization if you have a service member who has questions and concerns that especially of a more general nature. There might be a family hardship, might be any number of things going on in their lives, but this organization can be deeply, deeply helpful. And finally, as it relates to Jewish conscientious objectors, I am working with a group that's trying to revive the historic Jewish Peace Fellowship organization to provide support for Jewish conscientious objectors. And so I will put my contact info in the chat, but specifically if you have any Jewish conscientious objectors, I'm always glad to assist them. So I'm putting my contact real quick in the chat so you'll have that. But this is special. Again, I'm happy to talk to any COs, but especially for Jewish conscientious objectors, I really would like to help them in particular. So the other category of folks, though, and I want to spend most of the rest of our time about this, is talking about the issue of what if a draft is called in the future. So the challenging thing is if a draft is called in the future, it could happen very quickly. And the problem is that what we need to do to be ready, I don't think we're there yet. So let's talk about that. What would happen if a draft was called? And then how would that play out? And then, of course, how can we be ready for it? So first of all, a bit about the process. If a draft is called in the future, of course, the ground rules for it are already set by Congress through federal statutes, as well as the executive branch through regulation, and to some extent through some court rulings in the judicial branch. We, of course, know in the current state of the United States that everything's up for grabs. The executive branch is walking over everything else. So I'm going to tell you how I think how the rules should work. Whether it actually play out that way, we don't know. So under current rules, only men would be subject to a draft. That could change in the future. It would require congressional action. There's also, again, the possibility of a special skills draft. But absent those scenarios, it would only be men of certain age ranges. And what happens is that once a draft is called, once the names are picked, there'd be a random selection. But then at that point, you would get a notice very quickly if you were being drafted, and you would have a very limited amount of time to document what exemptions you might have to being drafted. Now, what are those exemptions? Well, a few of them include medical grounds, and this, frankly, is going to be one of the most important grounds for exemption under the current rules, because if you follow the rules to the letter, many, many people who are of draft age are not eligible for military service. This means that for young people, and if you have young people in your lives now, it's actually really important to get any medical issues they have that could be medically disqualifying documented in some way. I'll give you an example. Autism spectrum disorder. Anything within that range is disqualifying under military regulations, which means if your child is on the spectrum, if you're on the fence, should we get them evaluated or not? For the sake of the future draft, I strongly encourage you, get them evaluated, get it down in paper long before a draft is ever called. For any other medical issue, ranging from physical health issues like asthma, things like that, issues with musculoskeletal issues, joint issues, anything along those lines, getting those things documented well in advance, athletic injuries. You'd be surprised if you read the rules to the fullest extent of them, what is medically disqualifying. So that's the first thing. Other exemptions, there is a very limited exemption for schooling, which allows someone to complete the current semester they're in. If they're in college, does not let them finish their degree, unlike the old days, but would allow them to finish the current semester. There's also some limited exemptions for family hardships and things like that, which will be being driven by circumstances. Other exemptions, ministers and ministers in training are exempt. Now, during the Vietnam era, many people tried to creatively expand the number of people who are exempt under this criteria. And I'm fully expecting valiant folks such as the Universal Life Church, the folks that will ordain you if you fill out an online form. I fully expect there will be people that will try to claim that as an exemption for the draft in the future. More power to them. I think the odds of that being successful are slim. But nevertheless, I would encourage religious communities that have programs of ministerial training. You may want to think creatively about who you could admit to those programs and making sure that those who have potential to serve in that arena rather than military have those opportunities. Finally, there's conscientious objectors, which we'll talk about in a moment. Another area that we don't know how they will be treated are transgender people and non-binary people. Under the current rules of the Department of Defense, it would appear those people are barred from serving voluntarily in the military. Would they be drafted? Big question mark. What about someone who is transgender, who's transitioned to being male? Would they be drafted? We really don't know yet. We don't know how the courts will interpret those things for now. So there's a lot of question marks. Now, as it relates to conscientious objection, the process, what it would look like is you have a very limited amount of time from when you get your notice to appear before a local draft. Local draft boards are supposed to represent the community, including the ethnic socioeconomics of the community. But if it's been done in the past, it probably will not. It's going to look much older than the regular population. It's going to be much wider than the general population. I will mention that this is why peace activist people may want to consider trying to get appointed to draft boards, actually. And you can apply to be a member of a draft board today. Go to the Selective Service Administration's website. And I know peace activists who have done this. I personally strongly recommend doing this if your conscience would let you do this, because we need some soft-hearted people who are willing to say, yes, this person meets the criteria. They should not be drafted. But these decisions are made by local draft boards. So one thing, again, peace-minded people should consider is trying to get appointed to your local draft boards. But anyway, if the draft is called, someone gets the notice in the mail, they then appear before a draft board. At that point, they have the chance to represent documentary evidence, and those paper documents. This would be things like character reference letters. It might be evidence of their past ways that their lifestyle their peace beliefs are reflected in their lifestyle. It could be lots of different things. But you're also allowed to testify yourself before the board, answer questions to the board, as well as to call witnesses. And this is where having some time prepared well in advance can make a big difference. And so for this reason, many people say the best way to prepare for a future draft is for any person who's subject to it to begin preparing a CO file, a folder of resources. This would be things like character reference letters, but it also could be things like, I'll tell you what I do for my son, which is when we go to a peace protest, I make sure and take pictures of him at every single one. I do that so I have evidence that he believed in peace long before a draft was called. So we have something that has a date on it. Pictures today, you can pull up the metadata for a picture. You can find the date of it. That's important evidence. And so one thing I would encourage faith communities to do is when you have your members, when your young people are doing things for peace and social justice, documenting that can be very helpful because it can help to sway the case. So when we're thinking about this documentary evidence you prepare in advance, what we want to really look at is what do you need to prove to show you're a conscientious objector? In other words, what are the elements of conscientious objection? And again, I'm encouraging us all to think like lawyers. So we have to think about, to prove you're a conscientious objector, what do you got to prove? So number one, you have to prove you're opposed to all wars, not some wars. So that's the beginning point. And this is a challenging one for many people. Bear in mind, though, one important distinction. Notice I said opposition to wars, not necessarily to violence. Many people, myself included, could see circumstances when I might use violence to protect myself or a loved one in an immediate threat. When someone is right in front of you, charging at you, would you fight back? For myself, I would fight back. That doesn't mean I would go to war. War means that I'm saying not the immediate situation of dealing with an immediate crisis in front of me. Rather, I'm letting the government decide. The government's saying, go to this place and kill other people because we say so. War is something different than the use of defensive violence. I've known people who have argued, for instance, as COs, that they said, I support police work, but I don't support the military. Those were all legitimate viewpoints someone could have and be granted CO status. In other words, being a conscientious objector could mean you're a pacifist, but doesn't necessarily mean you're a pacifist. What it does mean is that you're opposed to all war. Secondly, your views about war have to stem from a place of religion or deep conviction that functions in a way similar to how a religious person's convictions function. And the famous case that dealt with this, there are a few cases, but one of the big ones in the Vietnam era was a case of someone who had told his draft board, I don't believe in God, but I believe in beauty. Beauty is the defining force of my life. I seek to make the world more beautiful. War is ugly, therefore I can't participate in it. His draft board says, that's not religion, reject. He took it all the way to Supreme Court and won. And the argument was what they came down to say, it's not the government's place to define what is and is not religion. If someone's beliefs functions like a religious person's beliefs function, they should be recognized. And so that's why it's very clear today that you can be an atheist and agnostic, a disbeliever or questioner, doesn't matter. You can be a CO. Also, you can be a CO and be a part of a church or a religious tradition that does believe in violence in certain circumstances. I'll give you a good example. The Roman Catholic Church, officially, their position is actually selective conscientious objection. Catholic theology says that Catholics must make individual moral choices based upon bigger, broader guiding principles, and on that decide whether a war is just or not just. That analysis doesn't work under US law because that would be defined as selective conscientious objection. However, can someone who is a Catholic still be a CO? Yes. They have to prove, though, that despite what their church might teach, they themselves are opposed to wars. Also, and I'll get to that, there is the issue of sincerity. And that's where we have, and sincerity means, do you really believe what you're saying? How are your views manifested in your life? One of the questions we had in the chat said, is there a concern about COs participating in martial arts, sports? What about video games? This is an excellent question, and it's one that I actually ask almost all of my clients to think about. The good news is there is not a right or wrong answer on this. I have had clients who have successfully won CO claims who were experienced martial artists. I have some who are very much into video games, but they needed to be able to explain why they morally participated in some actions, not others. I once had a client who was pushed back really relentlessly by his investigating officer because he participated in grappling type of things in training. They use these pugil sticks things that they fight with. And his argument, and he was asked, why did he participate in that? And my client's answer was perfect. He said, well, that wasn't lethal force. My line is lethal force. I do believe in the use of violence in certain circumstances. And for him, he was operating as a Christian. He said he thought the boundary line was lethal force, that Jesus said he saw that as the line. And so he was able to explain that. In the end, it worked out okay. But the issue is, can you explain it? And really, throughout the CO process, the most important thing is, can you explain how you got from point A to point B? Speaking of that point A to point B business, we also have to prove a moment of crystallization. Crystallization is the moment where one's beliefs go from just being a mere hunch, an idea, to being a firm conviction. So in other words, someone who says, I'm just not sure about war, I'm not sure if it's ethical or not, that person's views have not crystallized. But someone who now says, I cannot participate in war because of X, Y, or Z reasons, and here's why, that's someone whose views have crystallized. By the way, the crystallization moment is different in the context for the active duty member of the military versus the draftee. For an active duty person, they have to prove their crystallization moment happened after they enlisted. Because again, if they had it before that, they're a fraudulent enlister. You have to prove it happened afterwards. For someone who's being drafted, you need to show that that crystallization happened previously. So there's a little bit of timing issue of when the crystallization moment needs to happen. But you have to show that those beliefs are firm and fixed in place. Now, if we think about practically how a draft works, one of the most critical issues is going to be that of timing. Anyone who puts together a hurried application the week that they got their draft notice, their claim is not going to be considered as seriously by a draft board as someone who began preparing sometime before. It's not fair, it's that way, but that is the world we live in. And so this is why I think it's critical to begin documenting, even in small ways, what someone believes about war. And again, for parents, I want to encourage you that your kid, you may have a hard time getting them to sit down and write out detailed essays at age 16 or 17. Be great if they did that, but if they can't do that, find other ways to document their changing and evolving moral beliefs. So that might include, again, taking pictures of them at protest, documenting how they live their lives and how that peace is a part of their lifestyle. Doing these things, even those things, documenting those and finding ways to get dates tied on that. So you have dated evidence can make a big difference and you can turn things around. And so that's where, in our last few minutes we have together, I want to challenge us as a community, as a learning community here, to be thinking about what will we do to be ready if draft is called. During the Vietnam War, there was a massive nationwide and even international effort that sprung up to support conscientious objectors and war resistors. Today, are we ready? For synagogues, for Hillel centers, for communities of all kinds, it would be wonderful if we had someone in every congregation, every community center, who had some basic training on what it means to be a conscientious objector and knew how to get help in working through CO claims and how to help someone to document their beliefs. We're not there right now. Those resources aren't there. And so that's one of the reasons this training was designed really to be a teaser. Because what I'm really hoping is to ask each of you and those of you watching later in recorded form to take what we've talked about, to see the power of conscientious objection in the Jewish tradition. And it is a minority position. Let's be frank about it. It's not the majority position, but it has been a part of our DNA since Deuteronomy, at least. It's been there through the whole time. And so given that recognition, what can we do to ensure that this tradition continues? What can we do to help our young people be ready to face the challenges they may be facing? Right now, these choices are not as stark as what young people in Israel in the state of Israel are facing. But we don't know what the future holds. By being ready, by taking steps now and prepare, it can make all the difference in the world. And so that's why I want to encourage those of you watching to consider. I think in the future we may be offering some trainings through the Jewish CO project on draft counseling. That is helping trained lay people to know what they need to do to help a young person to prepare for a potential draft hearing and how to prepare to have a good, solid CO application already put together long before draft is called. And so, but also what can we do as we assist young people with this, also preserve what they put together, preserve what they've written, so that we can provide a reliable place that, for instance, another issue that's often common for young adults is that they move around a lot just due to life circumstances. And if you don't have immediate access, if you put together a good CO file like this, but you can't find it, it's not going to do you any good. And so one of the things that I think is important to consider is, for instance, giving copies of the file to organizations to keep on file. I know the Center on Conscience and War is one possibility, but I also would love to see something like this be created in the Jewish community, that Jewish young people could submit their files and it be kept on file, ready to go. And it does two things. One, it makes sure they're not lost, but also it ensures that if it's needed in the future, it's there, but also that it's dated, so that when a Jewish organization receives this draft application, they can be file stamped to show the date it was received, and that can be something that can be very compelling for potential draft. Yes, Becky mentioned like a Geniza. So having this reserve can be a really important thing. So we have a few minutes left for some we've talked about a lot of different things today, but I wanted to open this up for any final thoughts, questions, conversation. We have a few minutes left, so please feel free to unmute yourself and let's have a little conversation.
We've definitely, I work with kids at our local reform temple, and we've definitely had kids who have gone out of their way in their bar and bat mitzvah projects or devar tours that they've given, confirmation speeches, service projects that they've done through their temple youth program. Kids who had already this sense, this soft-heartedness already about themselves. I've seen them already, putting their voice out there in these kind of projects. And so I certainly think that, yeah, it would be great for the adults in these kids' life to be helping them keep a record of these things so that they could, call upon those memories if they needed to down the road and be able to say, hey, as your Sunday school teacher, as your Hebrew school teacher, I remember that time that you wrote that in class, or I remember what you spoke up about in class. And so it definitely has made me think differently about what kind of role I could play as being a historian for the lives of some of my students.
I'll also add along with that, there have been some really interesting educational things that have been done in other religious communities, including doing mock draft hearings. And this is where that you have, say, a class, say a high school age class is given, is basically they have to appear before a draft board of their peers and answer the questions that they might be asked in a draft board. And it can be a really challenging, and I would also turn it around to broaden it, to force conversation, is also to ask for those who would serve, explain yourselves. Why would you serve? And having those conversations can be a really useful thing. Adrienne?
Thank you so much, James. As a person who did serve in the military here, and as a person who served in the military because after my high school career, there were no jobs in the 80s, and I felt like I had no other options. It's interesting to see there's a certain amount of privilege that comes with being able to reject a job when they're with food and clothing that comes with it, and I don't think that there's a lot of understanding around that for some folks who hold that privilege. On the other hand, I had another friend who served and realized, I think in the midst of his basic training, he had enlisted voluntarily, but in the midst of his basic training, when it came to the weapons training part, he realized that he couldn't do this. It took him many, many months to get out of his contract, but it was a possibility, even in the moment, even although he was already in the basic training process, to be able to say, oh my God, this is me firing a weapon at a person. And to be able to just set down his weapon and say, I can't do this anymore. And again, it took many months for him to get out, but they finally did discharge him. So even if one is already enlisted or conscripted, there are possibilities of coming to that moment of realization once you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, and I do know several people who were conscientious objectors during the Vietnam War, were able to get different kinds of service. For instance, one who worked at the Stanford Library for the duration of the war as a part of a civil service instead. And then in my high school, had a secret class in how to resist draft for young men who were going to be called up. So there are a lot of different opportunities to find ways to sit with one's own convictions on these issues. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned the issue of finances and jobs. I mean, one of the most important things for peace folks who work in a congregational setting, one of the most important things we can do is mentor young people and helping them through these transitions, and knowing that not all kids have the same resources, financial resources, but also just parents who care enough to help to get them established in life, to help them to say, no, this is a good job for you, or I'll help you with the process of applying for. I mean, these are things that not all kids have access to. And the challenging thing is the recruiters are omnipresent in many schools. They are very present in society, and so they're always there with an answer. And again, it's the problem is that in the long run, we know statistically that people who serve in the military, and again, there are exceptions to every rule. I can point to many friends and family. I can say that their experience in the military were great, that they improved their life in positive ways. And so I don't want to downplay those experiences. On the other hand, for many others, if you look at employment rates after military service, life expectancy, those numbers go down for people that serve in the military. Suicide rates go up. So in other words, while the military recruiters sell it as you're improving your life, that may or may not be the case. And so one of the things certainly we can do is to play that role in young people's lives. It can make a real difference.
Right.
And also,
And I would just add, James, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. That they threatened me with a lot of money. Like they gave me a lot of promises for education, et cetera, afterwards, which many of which were lies. I had to go through my contract very carefully. But on the other hand, in a country that does not provide education, does not provide resources for people who are impoverished, and particularly people of color, I'm not fortunately, having that additional burden on myself. But I knew a ton of people who just weren't going to be having any opportunities without this particular venue. And so working toward creating better educational systems within our country is another way to help young people who don't feel like they have any other options.
And along those lines, I'll also mention, you mentioned earlier about the alternative service and the different paths those looked like. I will mention that for many people that did alternative service during the Vietnam era, it was a life-changing event. And I'm thinking of that again because of the physical setting. I'm here at a Mennonite church that once was an alternative service center. It was a house that up to about 25 young men lived in during the height of the Vietnam War. And for many of them, it changed their lives forever, the experience. And some people I'm still connected to for various reasons. People who became teachers because of their experience doing alternative service, served, ended up teaching for another 30 years, did all kinds of extraordinary things, became lifelong activists because of their experience doing alternative service. And in fact, what's really striking to me is that so many of the people I know that did alternative service, they speak in many ways in a very similar way to some of my military veteran friends speak about the better parts of military service, this sense of camaraderie. We're doing this together. We're making sacrifices together. I know one of my conscientious objector friends who did alternative service in Vietnam said, it was one of the biggest challenges of my life was living on a $25 allowance a month. Because he had his food and room and board paid for, but all he got was $25 a month in pay. And he even wrote his dad back home in the farm in Kansas saying, Dad, they don't give me enough money, send me money. And Dad wrote, says, son, this is good for you to learn to live on $25 a month. Anyway, that man now, he's in his 70s, but has had this extraordinary life of activism that was started in part by doing this alternative service. Trey, you have your hand up.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say again, thank you, James. Truly well done, as I wrote in the comments. But you touched base on what I'm going to detail very briefly. But it is the concept of national service as perceived from an American lens, not just from the European lens. But I started out my career, as did a lot of people, within the AmeriCorps Vista program, which started in, as many of us know, in the early 60s as the domestic quote unquote equivalent to the Peace Corps. And it changed the arc of my career. And I'm not going to bore any of us or myself by talking about my career, but that is to say, I remember being in the sort of 1 to 2 years of service as an AmeriCorps Vista member, and seeing people who had degrees in a variety of things, but who became lifelong activists professionally and personally because of those 1 to 2 years of service. And so I guess for me, in an ideal world, when it comes to something like conscientious objection from a Jewish lens within the United States or anywhere, I guess, it really would be wonderful if there were those sorts of options about, hey, okay, you can spend a year or two, and instead of maybe conscription, you can work at a homeless service provider doing resource development and fundraising. Those sorts of things should really exist. And I'll just close my comment by saying, obviously, we're living in an era of loss of funding, loss of AmeriCorps, loss of Vista funding, but one can dream, I guess.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Trey, because one of the challenging things we will face in the future if a draft is called is that the government has in the past set up criteria for alternative service programs, but did not fund alternative service programs, with a few exceptions, particularly in the Vietnam era. In World War II, they did fund more through the Civilian Conservation Corps, things like that. But during Vietnam, the alternative services programs are largely organized by the historic peace churches. And again, the Mennonites, the Quakers, Church of the Brethren. If we have another draft, one of the challenging things, those organizations, there won't be enough spots for alternative service, which means Jewish peace folks, we may want to seriously consider putting together programs to be ready to meet this need of how can we provide opportunities for young Jewish adults to serve in place of the military. And that's going to involve money, to be honest. That's going to be the biggest hurdle of all. But there will also need to be appropriate work that meets the government's criteria, but also that is hopefully meaningful and transformative for the participants. I think it's important that if we are taking this labor from young adults, we need it to be something that's going to positively impact them. And so we need to get the gears running on that right now if we want to be ready. And I thank you so much for mentioning that.
Was a comment that Jordan in the chat said, is there any plan to make connections to refuseniks?
Yeah, so someone had asked about plans to make connections with refuseniks in Israel. And yes, I will mention I've had some engagement with them already through some other groups. Veterans for Peace has been doing a lot of work with the refuseniks in Israel. VFP is a US-based peace organization of military veterans. And so I've had some conversations through them. And I would love to see more of that happening. I do hope as Jewish Peace Fellowship and the Jewish CO Project is more fully fleshed out, that may become an ongoing piece of our work, because I think it's really critical. So I will say one of the challenging things, though, on organizing with the Israeli refuseniks is the language barrier can be a challenge. Some of the folks I've heard speak are very fluent in English and are excellent at speaking. Others are not. And so I would throw that out. There's another need, though, is we need Hebrew language translators who could, for instance, take some of the speeches and statements made by the refuseniks, translate them into English for a U.S. American audience would be a really, really good thing. So there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of needs out there. So, well, we are out of time. Just to close, I'll mention that everyone who signed up, I do have your emails in the Zoom registration, so I will be emailing you with a link to download the Wrestling with Conscience book. I'll also have the rough outlines from today's presentations, and on those, look at the footnotes. That's what I mostly use in the outlines to give the citations to some of the resources. And again, we couldn't talk about everything I had prepared, so there's a lot more there. I encourage you, if you have time, to look at that some more. I do anticipate that maybe later this fall, we may do a follow-up event to this one that will focus specifically on draft counselor training. And I'm all ears for other ideas. I'm also very open to coming to speak either remotely or in person to Jewish communities on these issues. So please don't hesitate to be in touch. And again, thank you so much for everyone who participated today. You really made this a really good event, and I just appreciate you all so much. And thanks again. And I'm going to go and turn off the recording. And again, I think I put my contact, I'll put it in the chat one more time if you don't have it, but I'll put my contact in the chat one more time. But I'll also send this when I send out the follow-up email afterwards. So anyway, thank you again, and we'll hopefully see each other again very soon. Take care. Bye now.